Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Foof, written by Dark Prince 010. Yawning, stretching, and shaking, Runem did his best to shake the sleep out of his scales. The lizard-like alien made his way out of the public multi-car, the long and multi-segmented vehicle, pulling back away onto the magma rail before racing off. It was obnoxiously early for his species, which were typically nocturnal. But the human scientists who were seeking an insurance policy approval had said that they unfortunately were unable to meet any time other than this morning. The insurance agency Ronam represented was multifaceted and cross-galactic in scope, founded nearly 300 years ago by an enterprising sort of volcanic squid, seeking a way to safeguard their investments in lava bulls and some similar mercantile concerns. One of the things that set them apart, and something that Ronan was particularly proud of, was that they never refused a contract. The price might be steep, but for the right price, in theory, anything could be insured. That was part of what his job was for, determining the scope and significance of risks in order to make sure that a policy price was adequate to cover foreseen and even unforeseen problems without putting the company into the red. He saw a pair of scientists were already waiting there, a man and a woman, judging by their body morphology against what he recalled from textbooks and general species primers, but also both sporting short-cut hair and a surprising number of scars and healed marks of injuries on their faces and hands for a spacefaring species that had not fought a war in close to a century. He ushered them in, thanking them for their patience, and he minced the lek root quickly and carefully against the small serrated metal plate before shaking the shredded root into a cup and adding some steaming water. Taking a sip of the rejuvenating brew and feeling the stimulants within begin to finally make a headway against the aching tiredness, Ronan joined them in his office, going to sit behind his desk and sipping on a steaming beverage. So we spoke briefly on the vid chat, but I always find that these sorts of discussions are easiest to have in person. You are seeking coverage for your chemistry lab, is that correct? The humans nodded. We're reopening an older line of research into fluorine-based fuels and additives. Our sponsoring organization has acquired a significant deal on a fluorine gas giant and wants to find out how best to monetize their new purchase. Oh, that makes sense, said Ronan before pausing, tilting his head slightly. Fluorine, that's one is fairly reactive. I recall from my rudimentary chemistry courses. Would that be fair to say? Both humans turned to each other, and then some unspoken communication passed between them that he was unable to pick up on before they turned back to him in unison and said, yeah, neutrally. Well, I can see the document you sent to me refers to a number of components and processes, he said, holding up a data slate and gesturing to the gently glowing screen. But I'm afraid that a great deal of chemistry is far over my head, so I've asked for some expert help from the local Academy of Scrolls. They should be arriving any... There was a chiming from the front door to the office, and going over to it, Ronan pulled it open and welcomed in the expert that he had contacted. The professor, Dr. Metzes, was one of his own species, and looked similarly peeved and exhausted at the early start time. He offered her a cup of lek root as well, something she pounced upon and began drinking as she spoke between sips of the rejuvenating brew. I didn't have a chance to look it all over the file you forwarded, so my apologies if any questions or concerns I raise are related to that. I will caution I am not an expert in all branches and depths of the full field of chemistry, but at least in the range of organic synthesis and anything outside of radioisotopes. I should be able to have a fairly broad knowledge base. The humans both nodded. Both their expressions changed in a way Ronan couldn't quite decipher, as he gladly chimed in saying, Excellent. These two here were just telling me about how their parent company is seeking to encourage and sponsor research into fluorine compounds to best make use of a fluorine source of a new gas giant purchase. Ronan was surprised to see the color in the expert scale shift from annoyed purple to a flushed pastel pink of alarm, dotting here and there, It was mostly controlled, but an instinctive reaction to color made him slightly uneasy as the professor did her best to calmly state, "Oh, this should prove interesting." Ronan turned back to the humans. "Please, I don't want to delay you any further, and I would like to get this discussion wrapped up so I can begin the adjustment calculations and get a quote to you as soon as possible. Would you mind going over some of the primary experiments that you'll be performing and the risks involved?" The humans both cleared their throats, looking at each other, and said, "Well, the first primary compound we're interested in is working with something called Foof." Ronan chuckled, giving them a resigned smile and saying, "Well, that sounds fairly harmless as far as compounds go. What is the chemical structure?" The scientist, her pastel worried, already shifting to a green of suspicion that luckily the humans appeared not to have picked up on, steepled her fingers. The humans hesitated again and said, "Well, that is the chemical structure. It is dioxygen difluoride, FOOF. One of the humans, the male human scientist, mentioned offhandedly, "It's somewhat onomatopoeic." The other human elbowed him, but Ronan didn't really understand either the long human gibberish that they had mentioned, or why there would be brief physical roughhousing between the members of the species. But he supposed that it was likely just another quirk of how a species other than his own would communicate. Then he caught sight of Dr. Metzes, who he noticed was slack-jawed, her spines bristling with alertness and incredulity as she appeared to be dumbstruck. After a few moments she recovered and, in a hushed voice, said, "Did I hear you were saying the compound you want to work with is just 2 fluorine atoms and 2 oxygen atoms? You're not missing, say, an entire hydrocarbon chain or some other sort of spacer or stabilizer in there?" The human chuckled. "No. It's just a bit of a wild card as far as compounds go, so we do have plans to keep it stable." Ronan remembered some bits about stability and chemistry from dimly remembered classes, and he said cheerfully, "No, so like keeping it on ice or refrigerating it in a freezer, perhaps?" "No," said the female human scientist, "more like it needs to be constantly kept in liquid nitrogen, because if it comes up to even the temperature a regular freezer would be, it'll spontaneously explode." Ronan's hands abruptly dropped the small wooden cube that he had been fiddling with on his desk to occupy his hands, and he asked, "Explode? Did I hear you right?" "Yes," cut in Dr. Metzes. "That compound has only been characterized by our scientists via robots and careful trial and error from a safe distance." The male scientist added, "Historically, our species has been rather fearless when it comes to chemical experimentation." Ronan turned to the doctor for a greater explanation, and dropping out of the common speech, she shifted to their native dialect as she murmured, "Humans experiment with reckless abandon. That would be characteristic of a species that reproduces in litters rather than 1 or 2 young at a time. To say that some of their scientific experimentation is suicidal would be mischaracterizing their intent, but not necessarily the outcome." Ronan nodded, saying back in a tongue the humans could understand, "I see. And you have precautions against us?" "Well, we built in quite a few redundancies and allowances for additional labware and protective equipment for technicians running the experiments." Ronan had to quickly delete the typo he had introduced as the jolt of surprise hit him as he paused at the human's words. "You mean to say you do the experiments in person, with the reaction right there in the open?" "Well, not always," the human female piped up. "We typically try to keep it in a fume hood if we can, if we're expecting hazardous compounds." "I see," said Ronan, unfamiliar with the equipment that they were referencing. The humans must have picked up on his ignorance as she helpfully continued, "It's a metal bench with a glass-fronted window." "I see," said Ronan, now growing even more concerned. "And in the event that this compound explodes in this fume hood, won't that spray the glass shards everywhere?" In a cheerful voice, the scientist replied, "Oh, we have safety protocols and allowances to use reinforced leather aprons and face shields when handling it." He could see Dr. Metzes was still looking incredulous and testy, disbelief written across her face in the colors and shades and hues dotting her reactive scales. To the humans, they probably looked just like a pretty kaleidoscope, but Ronan could tell that if they had been spoken aloud, they would have just been half-spoken, half-wailed, sputtering incredulity. He did his best to tactfully avoid revealing the consternation to the human scientists, but he could still feel his own scales trying to shift with anxiety about what madness the humans had planned. My understanding is that you're seeking to develop a portfolio of compounds. Are there any other compounds your employer wants to have formulated and insured? The humans looked at each other. There was a series of small eyes widening, head bobbing, nodding, and some sort of unspoken conversation was had with their physical body language as well. Ronan couldn't understand it, but finally their female scientist spoke up, the male scientist doing a friendly human expression called a smile, although he did seem rather tense in the facial musculature. Thanks to a trace of the other element found in the same gas giant, we wanted to look into the possibility of soon producing chlorine trifluoride. Ronan jumped and Mister slammed her hands on the desk. Absolutely not! You can't seriously be... They can't seriously... What madness possesses you to... Now, said Ronan, raising his hands for calm as the humans eyed each other nervously. He turned to the humans. I apologize for the professor's outburst. She is not officially affiliated with the agency, and there is no such thing as impossible. We just need to make sure that the price is right for your policy. The chemistry professor crossed her arms, leaning back, scoffing, and annoying all three sets of eyes. This should be good, Dr. Metzes muttered in their native tongue, but he did his best to ignore her. I see. So what is this compound? It's highly flammable and reactive, said the scientists. So we're thinking of seeing if we can develop it and refine it for use, possibly as a chemical mining agent or a surface cleaner. Well, what kind of things could it clean? I would assume metal and glass, Ronan asked. The humans nodded enthusiastically. Yes, they said. It scours it off. Unfortunately, it's violently reactive. Oh, like with what? Ronan asked cautiously. It reacts poorly to plastics, wood. Lab assistants, interjected the professor. He gave her a glare, and then Ronan turned back to the humans. Well, at least it's something you can safely handle if there's a spill, right? Most labs have spill kits and absorbent compounds. Buckets of silica, I believe, are a favorable choice. Dr. Metzes cut in again, saying, You pour sand on that, and the sand will catch fire. Ronan's eyes widened, and then he began to chuckle, realizing Metzes had made a joke, until he saw her grim smile and the guilty expression on the humans' faces. Oh, he said, I see. Is your lab equipment prepared to handle it? You can put it in steel containers, and then it creates its own oxide layer and is stable. So long as you don't scratch, heat, shake, or otherwise disturb the oxide layer, interrupted the professor again. Because if so, she made a little explosive motion with all sets of her fingers, and Ronan swallowed. He shifted to the next page, trying to ignore the already eye-watering figures that had been calculated so far, before saying to the humans, Well, I think we've established what the operations are and the risks involved. In the unlikely event of something should go wrong, and at this Dr. Metzes choked a little, but trying to hold back a cackle, and both humans were very visibly coughed, clearing their throats. Noting that, and adding another order of magnitude to several calculations, Ronan said, Well, in the event that a breach does occur and this compound you're focusing on gets out, what safeguards do you have in place at the lab? Is there some special spill kits or something? No, the human said. If we spill the foof, it's going to evaporate before it touches the ground. Rather explosively, too. I see. And what about this chlorine trifluoride? Well, that's at least liquid at room temperature, said the other scientist hesitantly. But it would react poorly with the spill. Ronan could tell that she was holding back, and he looked to the professor for more context, but she simply smiled and nodded back to the human scientists, clearly enjoying watching them squirm. It would likely eat through whatever table it's built on, said the first scientist. And, the tile below that, said the other scientist. And possibly the foundations below that, replied the first scientist. And a solid amount of the ground below. And may the first ones help you if it should happen to hit the water table, Metzes added curtly with a grim glare. Well, said Ronan, I don't think I have any additional checks I need at the moment. Do you have any other supplemental information to add? The humans shook their heads. Nothing yet. Those are the primary ones we're interested in, and we would, of course, negotiate later if there are additional topics or molecules to research. Ronan nodded, hitting the tally on his calculations and taking a prolonged drink of his neckroot tea as he saw the staggering monthly sum for the insurance coverage. He glanced between the humans and the screen before slowly turning it around to show them. Here's your lab and research. Both humans looked and then could see visible relief across their faces. That's actually a little bit less than we figured it would be, said one. Yeah, this is great news for our comrades over in any one of the other research labs. Oh, said Ronan. What do they check on? Well, one of their parent company's assets has acquired quite nitrogen-rich soil and plants, even air for the stuff. A lot of it is evolved into crystals found on the ground, so they're seeking to explore hyper-nitrogenic compounds. I'm sorry, what's that? The word meant nothing to him other than knowing that nitrogen was just a simple inert gas. Well, it's just something with a lot of nitrogens on it. Ronan noticed Dr. Metzis had perked up from where she had slumped in exhaustion, distressed that this meeting had been more intense than she had anticipated. Oh? She now asked with razor-sharp interest. How many nitrogens on a single molecule? The humans looked at each other, and there was a brief moment of silence before one of them said in a quiet voice, At least 12, ideally 15. Ronan was watching Metzis, and her reaction now unnerved him more than he had seen before, for she went entirely emotionless. Her scales were very controlled, neutral black, uniform across her entire body. Well, he said, I think we'll be able to send our colleagues your way, said one of the humans at length, before they both stood, thanking Ronan and asking him to forward them the insurance quote for final approvals. As they left, he turned to Dr. Metzis and said, I don't understand what the significance is of more nitrogens in a compound. Is that bad? She simply pulled up a human video site, grimacing, as she swiped past all the banal human content until her search result popped up with what she was looking for. She said, This is a human compound developed several hundred years ago. It's used for mining, demolition, and military weapons. She hit play on the video, and Ronan watched, his eyes widening as he saw a massive explosion utterly destroy part of a hillside. This is compound trinitrotoluene, TNT. It has only 3 nitrogens in the molecule, and yet it contains enough force to level a building. She leaned down over the desk until her face was mere inches away from his, and in a strangled voice she said, Imagine what adding a dozen more of those onto a single molecule would unleash, assuming that you could even unleash it in the first place. She stood abruptly, her voice returning to a normal pitch as she simply said, I wish you all the best, Ronan, but I fear that your company is going to lose a great deal of money with your no-refusals policy. She strode to the door, pausing before leaving to simply make another explosion motion with her hands and smirking, and then left, the door slowly clicking behind her. Ronan buried his head into his hands as visions of pile after pile of smoking craters covered in acid and unquenchable fire. Craters which used to be expensive lab equipment and facilities filled his mind's eye, and there, as if by infernal punishment, he was there, a forced smile upon his face as he wrote checks enough to drain the galaxy-wide company utterly dry. Reaching over, he signaled a message to be sent to the head of policies for all departments in the entire arm of the Milky Way. Hi, Lyral, it's Ronan. This is going to sound crazy, but I think that we should broach the subject with the founder about refusing our first contract. Please contact me as soon as you get this. Sending the message, Ronan leaned back and took a long, shuddering drink of his tea, desperately wishing that he had something stronger in his office. He looked out his small office window at the bustling city below, wondering, with a hint of fear, where the mad humans were now. The humans, and their insane desire to blow themselves and everything around them into a toxic, burning smithereens. End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 peeps from channel memberships and Patreon. Charles Martel, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Charles Martel, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.